Is that working?
Yes.
All right.
So just think about it. We don't have the ability to mute one another.
Should have negotiated that in our.
All right. Well, it is about 4 o'clock, so I think we should be somewhat punctual. And I know you have other things to do as well today. So first of all, thank you all for being here. It's a delight. It's been a very busy summer in events, whether on this side of the pond or the other. I think we're already a little bit exhausted, but certainly I think it's important to take a step back and look at some of those really significant elections. My name is Garrett Martin. I am a professor here in the School of International Service, as well as the co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center. I will soon welcome our 2 other distinguished panelists, and I'll give you a little bit of the outline for how we're going to have this very informal conversation today. So to my immediate left, we have Michelle Egan, who is also a professor at the School of International Service, also a co-director of the Transatlantic Policy Center, which is one of the hosts of today's events. Professor Egan is an expert on the European Union, on trade, has written multiple books, and is a very, very active media commentator as well. And to our left, we're also delighted to have Professor Laura Beers from the History Department of the College of Arts and Sciences. Also very regularly features on prominent media outlets, including the BBC and many others. Has also written a fascinating book on Orwell's Ghosts. I think we very much seem to be in an Orwellian era, so I think it's particularly timely to have that perspective. And Professor Beers is also very much an expert on UK and British politics. So this is part of our broad series this year, which is about our Global Election Initiative. 2024 has been dubbed the year of elections because over half of the world's population was called upon to go and exercise their civic duty and vote. And even beyond this long list of expected elections, we've had some bonuses. Both France and the UK were not necessarily expected to happen this year, but they did, with some very important repercussions and some very important consequences. So we'll start by talking about the UK first. We'll shift to talk about France and the European Parliament as well. And then, of course, we'll open it up to all of you for your questions. So with that, maybe it's sometimes nice to start with a more light note. If you watch UK politics or British politics, there's no shortage of comedy as part of it. And if you followed the campaign as well, my personal favorite was Ed Davey, the head of the Liberal Democrats, who seemed to be spending his campaign trying to get a viral moment on a roller coaster, falling in a lake. So I loved him. That and Richie Sunak announcing the election in the pouring rain. That was really a great moment. So, Michelle and Laura, is there a moment that you look back fondly at that campaign? Or maybe Laura first.
Oh, I liked Ed Davey on the water slide too. I mean, you have a lot of classic Ed Davey moments, though they didn't really move the needle. I mean, I think what was most interesting is that the Liberal Democrats, and Ed Davey was the Liberal Democratic leader, had effectively a static share of the overall vote, but they used their votes much more efficiently in 2024 than they had in 2019. And so their actual number of MPs on effectively the exact same national vote share went up from 15 to 72. And as we look ahead to the US presidential election and all of these polls about the share of the popular vote nationally, it kind of reminds you that the national vote and your vote share matters a lot less than your strategic use of the votes that you get. And those votes that do or do not come in Georgia or Arizona or Pennsylvania count in a very different way than the broader 49-51 of a national election. So Davey was a good reminder that if you're going to get a fixed number of votes, you should think about how to distribute them most effectively. And he was also hysterical on roller coasters, water slides, stand-up paddleboarding, a series of ridiculous media grabs.
Need a little pickup. It's always, I do recommend looking down that online. It's always nice to have some comedy. We did not pick September 10th knowing that there was a US presidential debate, but of course, the references to that will be likely today. Michelle, what about you? Any moments that stand out or that brought us a smile?
The, on?
No.
All right. Beyond Davy, I think looking at everybody the night when the results were done and Mr. Binhead is standing there as a candidate and gets quite a few hundred votes, and he's standing there in Rishi Sunak's constituency. So to have to stand on the stage with somebody like that, tongue in cheek, yeah.
Yes, Lord Binface has been running against the sitting prime minister for multiple elections and actually performed best, I think, getting about 300 votes. So that was pretty historic for Lord Binface. So lighthearted moment aside, I maybe start really with the fundamental initial question. The Conservatives were obviously far behind in the polls, but they could have waited until December, January. They could have waited till Parliament really finished its term. And yet Sunak surprised people. Surprised many people in his own party by calling a surprise election with some historical irony, holding it on July 4th. So why do you think he did this? Like maybe Laura, what do you think was the impetus? Was this a sort of gamble? Was this some strategy behind this?
Well, I mean, you began by saying that we didn't know there would be an election this year. And I mean, technically we didn't, and that theoretically the election could have been held as late as early January 2025. But there is a 5-year limit for parliamentary terms. So that was the outside. And it is the prime minister's prerogative to call an election at a date of his choosing. It's one of the real kind of powers that the British prime minister has compared to the United States, where elections are at fixed intervals. And I think most people had put their money on the autumn, with the crucial exception of a few people close to the prime minister who conspicuously gambled and won some money on the date, and then were called in front of the regulator for insider trading, effectively. But the reason I think he did call in July was there was a good economic report in terms of growth and jobs, and I think he thought that this was maybe the Conservatives' best chance to capitalize on some good news. It was clear, I think, that they were not going to win whenever they called an election. But I think he thought this might be a better moment than done in the autumn. And also, if you wait till the end, as the Labour Party has learned to their disadvantage at various points in the last century, you can end up with your back up against the wall and the need to call an election not on your own terms. And I think that's what he wanted to avoid.
So, obviously the election results were, a significant loss, nearly a historic loss for the Conservatives in terms of the number of seats. So to what extent, Michelle, do you view this as simply the result of profound wear and tear? Is it the way in which Sunak campaigned? I mean, where do you explain, or how do you understand why the Conservatives did so badly?
I think that, I don't want to answer. Is that on? Nope. Yeah. Hello. Well, I think the first issue is 14 years, you're tired. I mean, you're tired with the existing political party. I would make the parallel. It's not just the Conservatives that the electorate was tired with. It was also the Scottish Nationalist Party, which was absolutely decimated in the election and lost to Labour. So, so first of all, a long time in office. Second, fatigue. Secondly, austerity. And, a feeling, the parallels are here that people had gone through a lot of austerity. And in Britain, there is a tremendous amount of regional inequality. And so the regional inequality, the left behind, and the sense that the Conservatives were not acting in their interests. So there's an awful lot of explanations you could say, to use. And I would say that, Keir Starmer ran a very tight campaign, a very boring campaign. He didn't have any, bloopers or moments. And I don't think he gave away a lot about, he has now, but at the time it was sort of like, what does he stand for? And so I think it was like, so a lot of that was sort of going on. And so there's multiple reasons that you might say that. The one thing I would say in terms of the last question, which is very important, is the Parliament passed a Fixed Parliaments Act to actually move us to kind of an American system where we would have every 5 years, we would know the date of the election. And the last several people, beginning with Theresa May and also Boris Johnson and even Rishi Sunak, threw that out the window and said, we're going to call an election based on when we feel like. So we completely violated some of our constitutional principles.
Well, that was perhaps one of the most short-lived constitutional principles to ever make it on the books in any country, in that it was put in place in 2011 effectively to hold together a coalition government that was perceived to be fragile and to appease the Liberal Democrats. But yeah, I don't think at the time, even when it was passed, anyone believed it would outlive that government, and it barely did.
So, it's quite clear that the Conservatives were, the reputation was in the doldrums. There's normal wear and tear, and then you add the sort of spectacle of Liz Truss versus the Lettuce, and the Lettuce winning, Sunak having his own, challenges. So it was probably expected that they were going to lose. But I'm sort of trying now to pivot towards understanding Labour's win, because there's a couple of paradoxical elements, and one you've alluded to, Laura. The vote share of Labour is practically the same that it was in 2017 when they did well, but did not get anywhere near a majority. Keir Starmer has a disapproval rating, which is still quite negative. So what explains, is it sort of good campaigning? Was it simply a case of they had to be a little less bad than the opposition? And what does that tell us about Labour's prospects as well?
I think it was good campaigning. Again, as with the Liberal Democrats, the Labour Party used their vote very strategically. Effectively, they had a 32.1% vote share in 2019 and a 33.7% vote share in 2024. Their number of seats in Parliament, and Parliament has a total of 650 seats, went from 205 in 2011 to 411 in 2024. So it more than doubled on an increase in vote share of less than 2%. So it was a much more efficient distribution of votes. But that also means that many of those seats are held on comparatively narrow margins. And it was a fragile victory. And it's more susceptible to, frustration with Labour, to a melt in third parties. Part of the terrible performance of the Conservative Party, and I'm sure we'll talk a lot about this in the next hour, was because of the strength of the far-right party Reform, which had 14.3% of the vote share, so a higher percent actually than the Liberal Democrats, who are usually thought of as a third party in Parliament, and who took votes away principally from the Conservatives. Reform only ended up with 5 MPs, but they really had a huge outsized impact on this election. And I think the role of the far right in European politics is a theme we're going to pick up more in the next hour.
It's a perfect segue then to sort of ask, because of course, you're right, in a first past the post system in a constituency, if it's just whoever has the most seats, if you have a rival outflanking you on the right, like what's happening with Reform, that led to many losses for the Conservatives. So, Michelle, maybe, I know it's a big question, but how significant do you see the threat of Reform for the Conservatives and how they might try to reinvent themselves? I mean, keep in mind that it was the fear of then UKIP that played a role in David Cameron making the pretty dramatic decision to have a referendum in the first place. So this has been a fear of the Conservative Party. How is this going to affect the likely future direction of the Conservative Party?
I think the big thing to take away from this, rather than getting into the weeds of the political parties and percentage of votes, is it's indicative of voter volatility. I mean, a lot of voter volatility happened under Boris Johnson in 2019, and the very famous red wall of Labour in Northern England. Some of these Labour seats hadn't gone Conservative since the 1920s, or since, and so forth. So I think voter volatility is really important here for the prospects of reform, but also for Keir Starmer holding on to some of these seats, that he's got the same problem Boris Johnson has in 2019, because now he's inherited a lot of seats in Conservative constituencies. What does that mean for reform? Reform had two issues. Because because Sunak called the election very quickly, they had to scramble to put people in to run in different constituencies. And to be quite frank with you, a lot of them were not vetted. So they may have been really a problem if they'd have got elected. But I think one of the big issues, and the best example to say how will reform do in future, is probably to look at Wales. The Labour Party have had a stranglehold on Wales for a long time, and Reform did exceptionally well in Wales and came in a lot of the places, particularly where I'm from up north, they came second in a lot of those areas. And they were very, very popular in Wales amongst the 18 to 29 set. So if you want to call them, if you want to call them the right or the far right, they got the youth vote in certain parts of the UK, particularly in Wales. So I think that's something that Keir Starmer is going to have to pay attention to.
So I want to follow up on this question of volatility, because you're right. I mean, Labour had one of their worst performances in 2019, now nearly one of their best again. So probably conventional wisdom in the past is if you had such a large majority, you probably had a strong chance of staying in power 5, 10 years or 10, 15 years or more. And there's been remarkable stability since 1979, really. I mean, prime ministers have come and gone, but it's been the same party has stayed in power for a long time. Is it not entirely unthinkable that we could have a similar dramatic swing in 5 years? Because Labour's going to have to really hold a lot of competitive seats. They're going to have to hold together quite a broad tent with very different goals. And Starmer's really has put forward kind of a boring, no big promises, but is that going to be enough to inspire voters?
It's a difficult question. I mean, Labour will be in power for 5 years. They have a massive majority. And even if, as we saw just today, they bleed on their left flank. Today, there was a vote on reducing the winter fuel allowance that's given to pensioners, so retirees, and means testing that fuel allowance so that if you had more income, you didn't qualify as a budget-saving measure. And the Labour Party had made the argument that they inherited such a disastrous hole in the budget that they were going to have to close it one way or the other. And while only one member of parliament, actually my former MP when I lived in York in England, actually one Labour MP voted against the government, there were 50 abstentions. And they can afford to lose 50 on their own flank because their majority is huge, right? But as time goes on, if there are these fractures repeatedly over and over within the Labour coalition, I think that spells trouble going into the next general election. And I think there's also the question of what happens to the Conservative Party and whether once they've held a leadership contest, which they're going to do this this autumn, and they kind of determine what their future path looks like, if they're able to bring back some of those Reform voters into the fold. Reform is hoping that they won't be able to, of course, and that Reform might even become the right-wing alternative to Labour. But I think we have a ways to go before that's a realistic possibility.
So, Garrett, the one thing that's really important here is we introduced voter ID in these elections, thinking about the current upcoming election, voter ID. We also did, we haven't done it in a long time, electoral redistricting. We did not have the same conversation that you do in the United States about gerrymandering. The third thing that happened in this election is that more than 100 MPs chose, primarily Conservatives, not to run for re-election. So incumbency wasn't such a huge deal. So that means we've got a whole bunch of people who are brand new politicians in the House of Commons. And so I think that's interesting for the governing for Keir Starmer, because I think he's going to face a number of factions in his own party. And then that goes to the parallel, what's going to happen with the Conservative election? They just had some voting today, and it looks like one of the candidates is dropping out. It's going to be a battle between the moderate centrist couple of people running, versus the more right. And so I think that's going to have an impact on reform. Who the Tories pick, the Conservatives, for the leadership contest. But I suppose I would ask a question to the audience, given your electoral college here. So I'm going to ask you guys a question. In 2024, Labour got 34% of the vote and got 63% of the seats. Okay. You have this discussion every time with the popular vote and the electoral college. Ours looks very skewed. How do you feel about that? Because this is about democracy. You can answer later. I'll ask you.
Yeah, I mean, that's an absolutely key question, because it's in terms of the trade-offs between representing where the people are and ability to govern. Because sometimes if you ask the people what they think, you get a very fragmented and divided answer, and then governing becomes a rather arduous task. I'm not saying that one is necessarily better than the other, but there are significant trade-offs, because it's true, like, is this a mandate when you represent a third of the votes, but you have 2/3 of the seats? That does create a real tension. I want to ask one quick question about, because it's been alluded to, the SNP, Scottish National Party, really has dominated until now Scottish politics for 10, 15 years, and nearly won all the seats in the previous election, and now have lost many. Is this a significant curtain call on Scottish independence for the foreseeable future, or should we still pay attention to that question in the next few years?
I'm happy to take it. I don't think that question is over. I think the poor performance of the Scottish National Party is a reflection of the aftermath of the failure of the last Scottish referendum, but also the insider politics within Scotland, where the Scottish National Party was caught up in a significant amount of corruption scandal, where Nicola Sturgeon, the longtime head of the SNP's husband, who was one of their chief fundraisers, was meant to have been embezzling and spending money on a sub-zero fridge for their house. I mean, there was a lot of just kind of ugly scandal around the SNP that did not help their cause. And I think that, combined with the failure of the Scottish independence referendum, kind of broke the stranglehold that the SNP had had over Scottish politics for over a decade, and kind of left a space for, Scots wanted a protest vote against the Conservative government. They are, largely the nation is not a fan of Tory politics. And if the SNP is seemingly at least temporarily invalidated, then Labour becomes the obvious alternative. But I think that the SNP is down but not out. And I think the issue of independence is similarly down but not over.
I want to shift to maybe two questions, one more domestic and maybe one more on the foreign policy side. Like, Starmer has now been in 10 Downing Street for a little over 2 months. And so I know it's way too early to start making categorical judgments about how he's governing, but maybe we at least can get some clues. So maybe starting with on the foreign policy realm, how would you grade so far Starmer's attempts to reset relations? I mean, he seems to be on a big reset tour, whether in Europe, he will be in Washington this week, Starmer. He's going to go and see the Taoiseach in Ireland as well. So how effective has that been so far in terms of repairing fractured relations after the Brexit impact and the Tory years?
Do you remember when Biden came in and there was, transatlantic relations was very, very positive? a lot of it was about tone. And the tone is very different, as in Starmer going out very quickly and meeting with different heads of state in Europe. So I think one of it is tone. I think the second issue will be here, there are some foreign policy commonalities that haven't changed from the Conservatives to Labour. And that's on Russian sanctions, it's on Ukraine, and it's on the importance of the transatlantic relationship, and it's on the importance. What's different is the language has moved from global Britain to a reset with Europe. But I'm also going to say that there is another partner on the other side of that reset, and it's called Europe or the EU. And they are right now, they're still putting in their own administration. They're still setting up after their own elections of the European Parliament and also the Commission. And I also think that, Starmer's been very unambitious in what he's asked for. And he's gotten sort of caught up in a lot of minor issues. And, if I was the EU, why would I want to renegotiate market access or student mobility or musician mobility? It's very indicative of this. For me, it's a little bit indicative. You have an ambitious domestic agenda, and you have this really there's no sort of strategic vision. And so that will be in the same way that we're seeing domestically.
Just to follow up on one element, do you think, is there an element for Starmer that there's a delicate balance? You want to repair relations with the EU, but you don't want to be seen as wanting to try and start the process of going back. Is there an element that you don't want to be viewed as trying to, undermine Brexit? No matter what one thought about it, it was a solemn decision by referendum. Could that be a factor why he's being extra cautious beyond his own personality?
Crickets. The whole campaign, he didn't want to talk about Brexit. As far as the Labour Party, Brexit is over. And right now they're just trying to mitigate some of the economic effects, which is why the agenda is very unambitious to a certain degree. And so from my perspective, why reopen a can of worms that absolutely decimated the Conservative Party and caused all the internal tension? And, for him, there's nothing he can do. Brexit is done. The trade agreement, the withdrawal agreement has been signed. So I think he carefully and probably strategically stayed away from that.
Track of the fact that Europe was an issue that was cross-cutting across parties. Even the Brexit referendum, Labour, more people voted to remain, but quite significant voted to leave. So that's also an issue that's quite divisive. Laura, on the question of what we've seen so far on the domestic front, there were sort of the measures they wanted to do, and then there were the crises they didn't expect, like the race riots. So how do you assess so far the response to that, or the response or the economic measures that we've seen so far?
So when Garrett introduced me, he mentioned that I'd just written a book on George Orwell and Orwell's continuing relevance in our 21st century moment. I don't know how many of you guys waste hours, minutes, days of your life on Twitter. But if you do, God help you. But if you do, you probably have, it's not escaped your notice that Elon Musk is convinced that we are living in an Orwellian moment in Britain. And that Musk has started using his platform of X, formerly Twitter, to post all of these memes and these captions sort of suggesting that a Britain in which illegal immigrants are allowed to run wild and, good patriotic Englishmen are being arrested for protesting against the presence of people who cross the channel illegally is somehow an Orwellian dystopia. That's his narrative, right? But this is clearly, was a tricky issue for Starmer. I mean, Starmer's Yvette Cooper, Starmer's Home Secretary, had been taking a very hard line about being, needing to get immigrant numbers down as well. Hadn't been talking about free movement by any stretch of the imagination. And Starmer had wanted to be seen as serious on immigration because he knows it's a big issue politically in Britain and really one of the big draws to the Reform Party. But at the same time, he has a law and order background, like Kamala Harris. Right? He's effectively, he was the Crown prosecutor, effectively the Attorney General. And when these riots broke out, which were largely, racist motivated riots, where most of the damage was perpetrated by a kind of far right nationalist, predominantly white English faction within British society, he took a hard line in terms of arresting people, putting them through speedy trials, clamping down on hate speech online. And this is what, in Musk's mind is somehow a dystopian, Charivari, an inversion of the normal order. But I think it wasn't something he was expecting to deal with right away. It's something I think that the majority of people within the center of British politics sort of think he handled this well. Justice was kind of swift. He kind of shut it down. But in some ways, it was a nice distraction from the underlying more serious economic problems that now are back center stage for the Labour Party in terms of, Michelle said, oh, well, one of the problems the Conservatives had was austerity. And sitting here in an American context, right, the idea of austerity as like an announced policy of any political party, this is effectively like a policy where everyone should suffer, tighten their belts, and like decrease their standard of living for the good of the nation and balance budgets. This is like the announced policy of the Conservative Party for the past 15 years, right? Would be insane in an American context. Like imagine either Trump or Kamala Harris coming out and being like, tighten your belts, batten down the hatches, live a bit more humbly for the foreseeable so we can get our ship in order. And people would be like, are you high? But the sort of even stranger thing is that confronted with the task of governing, Keir Starmer seems to have decided, well, austerity is the only real answer. We need more of the same. So, it is a very different political world than we are encountering in the US right now.
It's remarkable when you think about the English economy has been struggling with stagnant wages, stagnant productivity. So the impact of austerity has been really durably felt and is really limiting the space of what Starmer can do.
Well, we talked about Britain, but there are two other European elections that are very important. One, the European Parliament, and two, France. Okay, so we should definitely ask you about that. So we started off by asking and saying that Sunak called a snap election. So did Macron. Why?
Oh boy. Oh boy. So this is gonna be heavily caveated because I don't think we know for sure. It was a decision that really took people incredibly by surprise, including his own prime minister, who did not seem to know that this was about to happen. So, there's the immediate explanation. I think June 9th, European elections, the far right, Le Rassemblement National, clearly wins the election handily. It's a terrible performance for Macron's party. And so there's an immediate answer, which is it's a reaction to that sort of rebuke by the French people. Okay, so that's one element. But what's surprising is how quickly he does it. It's barely, we mentioned Sunak that you didn't have time in the UK to vet or prepare. This was 3 weeks. You had 3 weeks for parties to get organized, pick their candidates, and campaign. So it was remarkably short. So why did he do it? There's a sort of more honorable explanation and there's a cynical explanation I think we can emphasize. The honorable explanation is to say, look, you need to listen to the voice of the people. You've just been rebuked. It's a clear disavowal. Maybe you need to have a fundamental vote again to find out if we can have a majority and a clear governing majority. Okay, so that would be, somewhat honorable, in a sense that a politician listens to what the voters say and acts accordingly. The cynical explanation is that Macron thought, because the European Parliament election had also shown significant divisions within the left, which is really made up of a number of groups, far left, a more centrist, and the Greens, thinking that maybe he could recreate a new kind of broad centrist coalition that would include his forces, moderate parties on the right, and pluck away the moderate left. So basically, he could still find a way to create a new coalition, considering that the 2 years prior to that, his party was the biggest party in the assembly, but did not have an absolute majority and had been unable to govern effectively. And maybe the even more cynical than additional explanation was that even if that backfired and the far right won, yes, that would be disastrous in one respect, reputationally and so forth, but it would force the far right to start taking responsibilities for power. The far right had basically, for the past 2 years, really gone up in the polls by doing nothing, by basically being on the sidelines, letting other people fight it out. And the thought maybe was that if you let the far right show that they're incompetent, hopefully, then the idea of voting for Marine Le Pen in the more important presidential election in 2027 might not happen. So it's either you think about Macron as being sort of honorable or being Machiavellian. But either way, I think there was a lot of consternation once that election was announced.
Can I ask a question? Because I just, I read about my French politics in the newspaper, but it's not my area. So explain to me then the thinking, and there probably is the Machiavellian and the kind of honorable and the whatever potential categories behind Barnier. I mean, how then, I guess, we have, again, speaking about different constitutional systems, right? We were just talking about Britain in a first past the post parliamentary democracy. Once you get the results of a general election in Britain, the government is formed amongst the members of parliament themselves, right? But in France, where you have, cohabitation potentially between a president, and a then prime minister who could be drawn from a different party, but the president does have the power to appoint a prime minister, as I understand it, right? And and it was his decision to give Barnier the opportunity to form a government 5 days ago, which is not something that has an equivalent in the United States, right? Neither Harris nor Trump will be appointing the Senate Majority Leader in a few months' time. But what was behind his thinking in choosing Barnier?
Wow, how much time do I have? I think one of the fundamental questions, and I think maybe it will help if I try to situate that way, which is, and this is going to be, I'm a historian by training, so that's where I think. The Fifth Republic, born out in 1958, was de Gaulle, was a reaction to kind of sclerosis in the French Parliament. And so it was a system that had a very strong executive. The French president has a lot of power, has a lot of authority, especially in foreign affairs, but in general. But even the electoral system was really meant to facilitate the emergence of a majority. I think that's what you have in the UK as well, the first past the post. It skews between your percentage and the number of seats, but it's generally easy to get a majority. Not always, but generally it is. And so I think the problem there with the last 2 elections of the parliament is that you now essentially have 3 large blocks, roughly similar in terms of their support. And so you're expecting to create a clear majority out of a system that's now sort of tripartite, and where each of the bloc essentially hates the other. So the opportunity to create a workable, functioning majority are non-existent. I mean, imagine if tomorrow or November, you had a new party in the US, and you somehow end up, for instance, in the Senate having Republicans 40, Democrats 42, and the other party 18. How the hell would you govern? Okay, that's the same in the House. It's a system that's based on majority decision making. So The challenge here is the results in July were inconclusive. Yes, the Republican obstacle, the Republican bloc against the far right worked insofar as that they didn't get a majority. They weren't even first or second, they were third, but they're still the largest single party. The left sort of coalition of heterogeneous parties that don't necessarily get along themselves has the most seats, but they're well short of a majority. I think they're about 80 or 90 seats short of a majority. And then the rest of the sort of Macron's party is also has about 170 and is quite far behind. So you had a real problem of arithmetic. Okay, I think everybody knew what they were against, but it wasn't very clear what they supported. And in that way, it was a bit akin to, if you remember the good old days of Brexit and the never-ending debates in the parliament. It was very hard to find constructive majorities around any solution. Everybody knew what they didn't want, and they voted against that with great glee, but finding a constructive majority was a challenge. So that's the context. The constitutional question is difficult because the Constitution is quite vague. It simply says the president names the prime minister. It's easy when you have a clear majority, because even if it's someone not from your own party, then you have no real feasible option. But here kind of Macron flipped it on its head and said, look, the left who had the most seats put forward a candidate, but Macron kept arguing, this person's not going to last. There's going to be an immediate vote of no confidence. That government's not going to be stable. And so it became a case of, can you find someone who has a chance of not falling immediately to a vote of no confidence? You can understand institutionally the logic of doing that. You can understand that it's not healthy to have a government that lasts 5 days and is replaced and you try again. But there is an element that it does seem rather undemocratic that you're not even giving the chance to the biggest bloc to try and govern. So I think that's where a lot of the outcry on the left side of the spectrum is a feeling that Macron is kind of ignoring the results. He's not giving them a chance. They have the most seats. They should at least have a chance. So Barnier has been named, I think partly because I would say Barnier's been named because I think he has a reputation amongst other European partners because of his role as Mr. Brexit, negotiating on behalf of the EU. So he's seen as reassuring. He represents kind of the central right, which is the best gamble for Macron to trying to create a coalition. And he's hopefully not too distasteful to the far right so that they might not censor him. It's a gamble. It may not work. And I think it's also going to leave scars. The other point I should mention is constitutionally, you cannot dissolve the parliament for at least a year. So you're kind of stuck with who you have until at least July 2025.
I raised a question thinking you're the historian, so I'm not. I'm a political scientist, so we'll forgive you. So I'm going to ask the question about, you raised the question about reform and the disruption of Nigel Farage and what he's done to the existing political party system. What if I take that over to France? And what if I turn around and say, not about Le Pen or the right, but what will be the long-term legacy of Macron coming in as an outsider, disrupting the political party system when he first came in? And now we're in this space where he can't, his center or his coalition has collapsed in both the European Parliament and also nationally. What will be his legacy? And is he going to be the same disruptor that Farage is? You don't like that analogy, I know.
No, I hadn't thought about it in that way. So I think that's a really excellent question in the sense that, Macron took advantage of a moment. I mean, French politics since 1958 had been dominated by essentially two blocs, the Gaullist bloc with sort of associated parties, and the sort of left bloc that was generally dominated by the mainstream central left of the Socialist Party. For many reasons, those two suffered greatly and where there was real rebuke. So Macron really it was a big gamble in 2017. I mean, he was pretty unknown for many people in France even 2 or 3 years prior. He had never been elected to anything. He didn't even have a political party behind him until, a year before the 2017 election. His gamble worked incredibly. He essentially had a big avenue in the center of the political spectrum. I think what happened since is, and which I think limits the impact, is twofold. One, he really made the political system again about the president. He really concentrated all the attention, all the debates around the function of the president. That means that he becomes the lightning rod of all kinds of oppositions. For the left and the right licking their wounds, it also made sense that they were going to try to reorganize themselves in opposition to him. The idea of joining his coalition would have meant that they would have entirely disappeared. The center-right, the Gaullists, yes, they understand that they're trapped between the far right that's rising and Macron, but if they join Macron, they're just going to turn into oblivion and just be swallowed up. So if all the other actors had their own incentives and reasons to view him as the main figure to oppose. And so I think from his own decisions, but also because of the political calculations of others, Macron's popularity has severely plummeted. And it's not clear whether anybody will be able to pick up the pieces, because he's not obviously allowed to run again in 2027. Who is going to be the candidate of that part of the political spectrum? Marine Le Pen has shown that she's able to at least get a clear base of support, generally enough for her to get in the second round of the presidential elections. The odds are that she will probably be able to do so again in 2027. The key will be, who will she be up against? If it's a matchup between her and Jean-Luc Mélenchon of the far left, that is not a good choice. That is not a good political offering. These are political parties whose foreign policy views are rather toxic for a number of important partnerships, whether in Europe and the United States. So we're in still a political crisis. Even if Barnier is able to succeed, we're kind of kicking the can down the road to 2027, which is going to be hugely consequential.
Well, I guess, should we, before we segue to the European Parliament for the last few minutes, just put and I'll sort of put it to myself as well as the two of you guys. Are we entering a moment? I mean, we look at US politics, right? And we have the presidential debate tonight, right? But US politics is sort of ossified in this two-party system where you're really fighting over a very small number of votes, and maybe they're even less undecided voters than it is just who's more effective at getting the vote out. But across Europe, you see, and particularly in these two instances of Britain and France, a kind of disruption to what had been a fairly stable two-party system. And do we think that sort of like when you throw a stone in the algae on top of the canal, about a mile or so from us, right, eventually the ripples disappear and it all closes over again and will return to form? Or do you think that this really is a moment where those kind of old stable two-party realities might be permanently broken? I'm sort of asking the two of you guys because I'm not quite sure what I think in answer to that question.
I've spoken more. What do you go first?
Well, first of all, Alison is in the room and she's Scottish. And I also think we need to disaggregate Britain, because Northern Irish politics doesn't look like the rest of the UK and never has. And I think, Britain, if we want to talk about this, the two-party system that may come back is in England relative to the rest of the country. I think there's the issue of voter volatility and the number of people who are now, they don't have a degree when they say, are you an independent, like we do here in the United States? The number of people who have less affiliation with a political party and less membership with a political party are, has really diminished, particularly in the UK. But it also means, from a democratic point of view, that a small proportion of the electorate makes consequential choices. I'm thinking here, the next political party leader in the UK for the Tories is going to be selected by the MPs themselves and a small number, 200,000 people who are members of the Tory party and carry a card-carrying membership. That's, to me, astonishing and undemocratic. You use that phrase. So I think that, will they go back? I think it's hard to say. I think it's going to depend on the leadership contest for the Conservatives and how well they do. But I also think that what is taken off the table in Britain, and I'll leave you to answer for France, what it's taken off the table in Britain is, given the success of the Liberal Democrats, I think it's taken off electoral reform. And we're going to stick with a first past the post system, which, usually ends up being, two large political parties. But, I think our constitution and institutional rules matter. But, from looking at the rest of Europe, I think we tend to forget that, is France unique, trying to put a cabinet together, a prime minister appointed, when we've got Belgium and the Netherlands and Austria and others that are both coalition governments, but often take a long time to put it together.
So I think a couple of observations, I think, to try and connect maybe some of the discussions we've had already. And it's something I've been thinking about, because I feel like Brexit and France are colliding in the same way that David Cameron's decision to call a referendum was rather short-sighted and created all kinds of consequences. You could argue that Macron's snap election call might be something very similar. And then the fact that Michel Barnier and his Brexit negotiation is now prime minister, I feel like, everything's coming full circle. But I think a couple of questions that I think are really fundamental here. When you don't have a two-party system or clear two-party system like you have in the US, where you alternate between one party or the other, that's pretty obvious. What do you do when you have the far right or far left fringes that are still getting a lot of people? They're getting a lot of votes. We may find that distasteful. We may find that deeply problematic. But how do you navigate that phenomenon? I mean, I grew up just outside of Paris. The National Front or National Rally has been a feature of French politics for 50 years, has received sizable amount of votes for 40 years. The policy of essentially quarantining it, creating kind of a belt around it to not include it in government, has not worked. I'm not saying the other option is better, but it does create some fundamental challenges. How do you deal when large parts of the electorate are being seduced by the fringes? Whether we think it's right or wrong, it's an issue. The left behind constituencies that we see in many countries, whether here, but also in Britain, in France, in Germany, and elsewhere, are clearly feeling not empowered. They're not feeling represented. They're feeling resentment against the more dynamic metropolitan areas. That is not a new phenomenon. I don't think governments in the West have found a good answer to that. And I don't think that's going anywhere. So I think that's, a second big element here that we, needs to be thought through and needs to be addressed. Because, and I think the third element too is, and this is taking really a long historical perspective. And I think Michel's touched upon it with this idea of volatility. Post-war, you had strong loyalty from voters to a party. If you were in a trade union, you were historically voting for Labour. That was a key part of your identity. You voted that way. The Western economies are very different now. People's career trajectories are very different. They're much more like shopping around for votes as opposed to necessarily feeling a strong attachment to parties. I think that's translating in the great fragmentation that we're seeing. Parties are born quickly, they emerge quickly, attain great success very quickly, and really are disrupting sort of political systems that used to exist. We've seen that if you followed what happened in Germany, a little over a week ago, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, the far-right party, did very well in Saxony and Thuringia. But so did this new breakaway far-left party, the Alliance for Sarah Wagenknecht, a party that didn't exist 10 months ago. So I think that speaks to a phenomenon we're seeing where political parties are rising quickly, are being able to be very disruptive, and that's making governing, I think, extremely difficult across Europe.
Should we segue from there to Europe, given where are we? I mean, we should think about, I guess, the fact that in many ways, the situation in France was directly precipitated by the European elections. And Nigel Farage, who's leader of the Reform Party in Britain, is someone who is kind of a creature of European politics, despite his very anti-Europe stance. Right? He was a member of the European Parliament for a long time, drew a salary to basically not participate. But the place of the far right within both of these political systems is very much tied up with the broader European system and the place of Britain and France within a kind of post-Second World War European concordant. And I guess the question that I have, for Michelle, well, for all of us is how does Europe fit into this story? Is it a story that's running in parallel, or to what degree is it integrated into these national narratives that we've been discussing for the last hour?
That's a tough question. I think the first issue is that, the one thing to think about in the context of the United States is that political parties are publicly funded in Europe. And that makes a big difference in terms of there's no PACs, there's nothing like that. But what we've seen the up and down movement of far right since the 70s. And they've, had periods of high points in the 70s and then come down. But I also think that the spread of far right is much broader now. I'm always interested in what countries don't have a far right. And I think here about Portugal, probably even with Chega, Portugal or Ireland. Why are they unique relative to the rest, if that makes any sense? But I would also say at the European Parliament elections, yes, we paid attention to the fact that there was an awful lot of radical right, far right parties elected at the European level across almost every country. But the bigger issue is that the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, and the Socialists will still have the majority in the European Parliament. I think what will happen with the radical right in Europe, what we've seen so far, is that they've already split. They're already in two political parties. And, so there's a sense that, if I look at the sovereigntist, the European sovereign group versus the Patriots for Europe group, those are the two radical right groupings in the parliament, there's a little bit of, they're a little bit too much for me. And so even there, what we've done is almost created a cordon sanitaire for the AfD, because they're the majority in that one radical right party, and everybody else has sort of moved to the other. So, you know, parties come and go. You're absolutely right. And, you know, what we tend to forget is just how much more institutionalized they are and have been since post 1989 in Western Europe versus the real volatility of political parties in Central and Eastern Europe and how they've come up and so forth. So I will say that you know, it's not probably answering your question fully, but I'm just waiting for, you know, will these two radical right parties, they agree on some things. They don't like the Green Deal. They don't like immigration, but they're divided on others about Ukraine, about Russia. So putting them all in the same tent is sometimes very, very problematic.
I would just one quick point, and I think hopefully we can also bring you to your questions very soon. But I would say the European Parliament is connected because for financial reasons. I mean, far-right parties have been able to maintain, to get funds, and sometimes you know, they sometimes have actually also, in the case of France, the far right is now being investigated because for basically fictitious work, that they would get money for employees supposedly working in Brussels and were then using it just to sort of recoup their financial situation at home. I would say, secondly, in a way, the fact that I'm loud. Can you hear me at the back?
No.
Okay. Better? Okay, no. The second element is the paradox of the fact that this election has been.
Maybe it's you.
So I think the paradox here is that the elections have received more attention, the European election, in part because some major transnational challenges that we've seen. There's been more European-wide themes have animated this recent election. If you think about COVID, if you think about Ukraine, if you think about energy, if you think about Gaza, these are all themes that generally, not uniformly, but were widely debated by different countries. So the increase, albeit small, in voter turnout has also elevated the importance of how people vote in the European Parliament. And so if there is a significant rebuke of a national government on the European level, we saw clear repercussions at home. And I think, thirdly, I think it also matters because what we're seeing is the same dilemmas or the same difficulties of how do you address the fact that you have nearly 25% of the parties represented are deeply skeptical of the European institutions. They've changed their tune. They're not talking about Brexit or Grexit or Grexit or combination, a creative combination. But more perniciously, they're talking about reforming from the inside, which essentially means a la carte, picking the little bits that you like and sort of de-emphasizing cooperation otherwise. So I think that the same dilemma here of how do you govern when 25% of the people in the hemisphere are skeptical of the institution where they're sitting is a big challenge. So I think in that respect, I think that mirrors what we see. And maybe the last point too is it's still very regional because yes, the far right did a bit better, but in certain regions did terribly. They did terribly across Scandinavia. So the picture is still very regional depending on sort of areas. I'm afraid of the microphone. We invite you to come and ask questions. And please line up. Don't be shy. Welcome all questions.
Ones to Garrett.
If you don't mind lining up on this microphone on both sides.
Yeah.
There are a lot of you, so I just ask, be very concise and make sure whatever you say ends with a question. So why don't we start on this side with it? Maybe we could take two at a time. Yeah, what is the two gentlemen there first?
Okay, perfect. It works. Okay, so my question is. I'll just speak out of this.
Let's turn off the lights.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Perfect. Okay, so with Donald Trump's assassination attempt, the race riots in the UK, and even Nigel Farage's milkshake incident. What do you think of these trends of political violence and targeting that are increasingly happening and spreading across Europe? And how should they be addressed by the governments if previous strategies have not been working?
With the not necessarily the collapse, but with the Green Party losing almost 20 seats this election, how do you think that's going to impact the future of green policy in the EU? So the last 15 years, and they've been making all these big gains in climate change policy, is when the Green Party has been insanely popular in the European Parliament.
You want to take 2 or 3?
Turn it on at your own risk.
Yeah.
Is this appears to be working now. So I've been kind of wondering, so Russia has, I guess let me organize my thoughts. In 2016, the United States, there was the Cambridge Analytica thing when the Russian government supported Donald Trump's far-right presidential bid. I'm wondering, and I've heard a lot of stuff about Europe, similar kind of stuff happening. I'm wondering, like, now that Russia is in this big war in Ukraine, and it's been a lot harder for these far-right parties funded or supported possibly by the far-right party in Russia to openly support that, what do you think will happen to this rise of right-wing stuff? Because to me, that's felt very kind of from that direction. That seems to be the thing.
So let's see. Is this guy working? Yes, it is. And hopefully no screeching. To the question about political violence, and I was in Britain this summer during the riots. I actually had a book event that was canceled because no one was really leaving their houses at Leeds in the evening for a while because they had become so destructive. And I thought that the conversations around those riots were interesting because on the one level, people took them fairly in stride and they were like, well, this is just effectively blowing off steam because there, are all these voters who are angry that their voting for reform didn't actually lead to reform having seats in parliament, and so this is just kind of getting that anger off their chest in a kind of purge. And it took me back to 2011 and the riots that summer, which were riots that were led more by, the political left and by Black communities in Britain, sort of as a different, almost like purge. But I mean, there's something pretty troubling about thinking that, once a decade or so, British politics can't be contained within a first past the post parliamentary system meant to limit it to, large majorities. And there's kind of a violent in the streets purge. I mean, it's, but I guess the question will be then, to what degree this is part of a broader phenomenon, which, as you pointed out, is kind of linked to declining respect for politicians. This episode of, I think it was in Newcastle or Sunderland, I can't remember, but someone throwing a milkshake in Nigel Farage's face, or the assassination attempt on Trump, and to what extent this is, was kind of an isolated incident, but also it raises the broader question of what you do about the idea that, these constitutional structures are intended to effectively create, as Michelle said, a cordon sanitaire around kind of fringe parties. But when those fringe parties, represent a significant minority of the population, and they feel that the structures of the various types of constitutions we've been discussing today are effectively, designed to limit their voice, then how do they make their voices heard if the ballot box isn't the solution? And you just have to hope that the solution doesn't become, an increased incidence of political violence. And I'm hopeful that it won't, but it was a disturbing time in Britain this summer, to put it mildly.
Britain's had race riots before, Notting Hill, Liverpool, and so forth. So, this is now much more tied to the right. I'll go to Trevor's question because he asked about about the Greens, the environmental at the European level. The Green Party at the European level in the European elections has about 52 members, lost about 17 seats. Not a good sign going forward. Yet everybody is still talking about carbon renewal. And I think what they've done is, yes, it's unpopular with a number of them on the radical right. They don't want to have all of this carbon renewal. You've had resentment from agriculture and farmers. But, if I look at what you're going to be with the legislative agenda, the big new term is competitiveness. And Draghi's report came out this week, and he's talking about competitiveness. Where are you going to find competitiveness when the United States and Biden has put all this money in terms of the IRA and green tech? You've got to do the same thing in Europe. So I think you're going to sort of see it, perhaps not as kind of the green movement in the traditional Green Party sense. You're going to see it tied very heavily to green technology and so forth. And we should also remember, the first time a Green Party made a political breakthrough was in the European Parliament elections, and that was the German Greens. And by the way, Petra Kelly, who founded the German Greens, is an SIS alum. Just so I get
Just very quickly on the question of, yes, I mean, there's been a change. There was at least a change in communication early on in the outbreak of the full-scale invasion. I mean, the invasion didn't start in 22, but let's say the full-scale invasion in 22. But we're still seeing now signs, subtle signs, like in Germany, for instance, the far-left movement, the Alliance for Sarah Wagenknecht, is essentially adopting a very pro-Russian language, blaming NATO and the West for what happened and for the situation we're finding itself. You're finding sort of subtle ways where you're hearing parties on the far left or the far right in other parts in Europe, like that France Insoumise in France, saying, well, it's a tragedy, but we need negotiations, without a clear sense of what that means. So there are some sort of Russia-friendly or Russia-adjacent narratives that are coming back, especially as the war is more prolonged. The outcome is not quite as clear. The costs of support are mounting. So I think you are seeing the sort of the Putin-friendly, putting their heads a bit more forward and sort of being a bit more sympathetic to Russian narratives now. Of course, they still had to sort of toe the line to a degree after the invasion because it was unavoidable. But I don't think they fundamentally changed their perspectives on Russia and other actors.
So, is it on? Is it on?
So if you push it up here, there's like a little.
Oh, yes. Here we go.
All right, is that good? All right.
Yeah.
So I know you touched on a little bit how Macron's influence has sort of been falling, especially after the snap election. But one of the hallmarks of his foreign policy was European strategic autonomy. And so I wanted to ask, do you think that there's still a place or appetite for that in modern Europe, even without Macron, in a similar way that, say, Trump's protectionism and imposing tariffs on pretty much anyone who he saw fit has kind of gained an audience in America, despite him not being in the presidency now?
Yeah, look, you've been talking a lot about disaffected and dissatisfied voters driving big electoral changes sort of everywhere. Do you think a lot of these people who are coming in and getting elected have the ability to make the changes to keep themselves in office in the next round of elections or as it goes forward?
Hi, so yeah, when you were talking about like the French elections, right? National Rally has been on this, continual drive upwards of more and more success. And I think you mentioned this as a theory, like put them in government. What's going to happen? They're going to have to govern. What is it going to change? Like, I think it's a convention that people might hold around as a response to like the rise of the far right in Europe. And honestly, I think in some cases it might have actually been shown to work. I'd say in Italy, like the Meloni's government has become more moderate as it's been put into office. Is it a veritable solution, though, to take such a risk, put these very extremist parties into positions of government? Like, is there anything else that we could possibly do otherwise to regulate a movement that's basically based off of being the opposition?
I'm so sorry, but I have to disappear. I teach an entirely different class. We're doing Lincoln and the Bardo in 15 minutes. So I have to
We'll make
put
a
my
plug for her
different
book.
hat on and change my brain. But thank you guys for coming out. I hope it was an informative session, and I really enjoyed getting to be a part of it. It was, you did not, in announcing me, Garrett, say that I have an affiliate professorship as I asked. But like you, I'm a historian to my core, but I very much enjoyed this afternoon.
Plug for the book. It's gotten a lot of big reviews.
Woodrow Wilson on Monday, you're giving a talk about the book?
Oh, yeah.
You
Yeah,
always have
if
to
any of you guys want to, it's over Zoom. I'm doing the Washington History Seminar on Monday for the Woodrow Wilson Center.
I'll come.
Yay. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. So I'm going to take the last question first. When people first started writing about far right, people like Reinhard Heinisch, way back, I have the paper actually that I wrote with him from 2000, and he was writing about the Jörg Haider, and he was writing about Austria. And at the time, everybody was upset because the conservatives brought in this radical right party, the FPO, into government. And they actually ostracized the rest of Europe, Austria, kind of an odd way of phrasing it, ostracized Austria. And the conservatives said to them at the time, Schussel, don't do that. Don't do that. Let them govern and let people see that they can't govern, that they're ineffective, or maybe it will tame some of their positions. And that was the scholarship based on the FPO and Austria way back in 2000. And that was the academic scholarship. Then the problem is we have people now like Orban in Hungary who, that notion of when they govern, they'll become more moderate has not happened because, Orban, because he won a majority, has been able to, this isn't autocracy. This isn't authoritarianism in pushing legislation through. He had the majority to basically undermine the rule of law, cut down media, and basically, undermine democratic institutions, but from within, which goes to Garrett's point about, is that a concern that we have about what this group of far right will do within the European Parliament? So our literature has now changed how we study the far right, because now it's sort of like, we no longer have this view that they tame, they get tamed if they govern, or they get become more moderate, because we've seen the results and know that doesn't happen. You have one on strategic autonomy. You want to do that one?
Just to clarify, I wasn't necessarily saying that bringing them in power is the right idea. I was saying that number of paths have been tried, either ignoring them, either co-opting their policies but not bringing them in. But that has not always worked because people start saying, well, I prefer the original to the copy. Or you can bring them, or maybe let them in power. But I would say, in the Italian case, I'm looking at Alice, maybe they've been moderate on the foreign policy side. I'm not sure domestically people would necessarily agree that Meloni's been that moderate, but yeah. On strategic autonomy, I think it's a good question. I think, to be fair, Macron's style could be abrasive and was not always popular, so there were pushback. I think it's a long division. There's broad agreement in Europe that Europe needs to do more and to be united and speak on the world stage. That's sort of a common platitude of EU speak. The problem has been, what does that mean in practice? and what does it mean for relations with the United States? And that's been the big dividing line. I think the French were viewed suspiciously because there was always a sense that they wanted European strategic autonomy against the United States. And that was a bit of a no-no for a number of countries. I do think, that being said, I do think this would outlive Macron because for the main reason that there's an understanding amongst many European countries that the United States is less, the trend line is to be less involved in Europe. That seems to be, the less appetite for it domestically. And also, I think they have to hedge their bets. I mean, there's been such oscillation from Trump to Biden relations with Europe that they cannot just be dependent on the wills of 10,000 people who live just outside of Milwaukee. I mean, that's not a way to operate. So you've got to be able to plan and to be able. So I think the needle has moved, but there's still long division lines within Europe. So did we address the question? I can come back to it after, but why don't we take all the next 5 questions because I'm mindful of time and I want to hear from everyone.
Sure. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Saida from Nairobi, Kenya. I just have a question. Well, I've consulted for the European Parliament in 2023 regarding the Voices in Exile policy brief, and the European policymakers were somehow to strengthen the voices of activists that are, championing democratic reforms in key countries like China, Belarus, and Nicaragua. But in 2023, the same year, in September, around 8th to 9th September, in Estonia, the Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, was really, calling for all governments, because, we were there for Open Government Summit, calling for governments worldwide to support Ukraine reconstruction. And now that she has resigned from her position, of course, in advance to her appointment to the EU High Representative to Foreign Affairs and, of course, Security Policy, do you think she has some strength in influencing the EU member states, not just Estonia, especially, the members of Parliament of EU member states to then influence and strengthen EU legislative affairs? Touching on Russia relations to the EU neighborhoods, recognizing that Georgia is currently fighting against, Russian aggression with the foreign agent law. Do you think she has some strength to then support the legislative requirements that will then safeguard EU member countries from such? Thank you.
This one, I will take all of them in one go, so be efficient.
Regarding Germany, so it's clear that all of the mainstream parties have verbally committed to not allowing the AfD or not form a coalition with the AfD being involved. How confident, just curious personal opinion, how confident are you guys that that verbal agreement, emphasis on verbal, will stand over time?
Okay, so my question focuses on the European elections and whether you believe that Europe can act as a unified geopolitical player, because in most recent European elections, it seems to have created a power vacuum within Europe. So most major European leaders have been weakened. I think of Ursula von der Leyen, Macron, Scholz. They're all in a weakened position domestically. And can you have a unified geopolitical player within the European Union that doesn't have one defined or powerful leader within the bloc, because they've all been weakened by recent elections? So that's my question. Thank you.
I don't need the microphone.
Oh, okay.
So our political entrepreneurs like Sarabad Connect, Macron and Farage, the norm now in Europe? And if they are, what can the establishment parties do to try and capture back some of the white working class voters that have drifted over to these upstart populist parties?
Okay. So that's all, political entrepreneurs like Farage, Wagner, and others have become very good at capturing some fringes of the vote. Can you give it back?
I will sort of turn it on.
So I have a question about Britain and France specifically. These are both countries where their capital cities are really a huge part of their voter base. And I wonder, could you talk about how voters in London and Paris have changed their perspective or if they've changed their perspective at all in these most recent elections and how that's impacted the country as a whole.
With democracy promotion and Estonia and us, we had confidence with not working with the AfD and
My question.
EU as EU as a geopolitical actor.
Okay,
No, yes, no.
gosh, no, we can go through. So London now, given the electoral results, is very variegated. I think, Brexit revealed just how much there is London and the rest of the UK, economically and financially. And it's been less, parts of London have been less, and the home counties around it have been less hard hit, and they've been traditional conservative areas. What we've seen in the last election is that some of those areas, for the first time ever, areas like Horsham, which have been conservative for decades, went Labour. But some of the other areas went Liberal Democrat. So how long this is Starmer's problem. He's never had a wealthy constituency like that, because typically Labour has been up north in Scotland and in a much more impoverished neighborhood. So he's going to have to, think about that in terms of, he's got a very variegated set of both MPs, but also electoral districts now. So I think that I would say when you're looking at Britain, look at the metropolitan cities, not just London. One of the things that's going to be very important is how much devolution he will give to Manchester, Birmingham, and other cities to make certain decisions. So I always feel that we have two Britons, a London and the rest. So I'm going to put that out there. The second comment was geopolitical actor. The EU is a geopolitical actor and levels of unity. It's kind of ironic because, if Britain was still part of the EU right now, we would expect Keir Starmer, given his electoral position, to be in a leadership role. That said, historically, social Tony Blair have been a leader in Europe, and he never really was. So just because you have the electoral mandate doesn't mean to say you'll be leader. But quite frankly, the big issue here is going to be when you bring all the national leaders together, how many of them are social democrat and how many of them are conservative? Because, they've got to get together to pass legislation. So, we are going to see that. The one thing that sometimes happens, though, as you pointed out, from appointing an Estonian to a high-profile position, small states sometimes punch above their weight. And, I'm sort of looking at this now thinking that I grew up in Britain, and Europe's always been a dividing line across the political parties. But in many, many countries, it wasn't. If you look at, there's traditionally been a lot of support for European integration in most states. But I think when they are going to look at the presidential election, and that may be a unifying factor, they're going to have some level of unification on some policy areas, technology, competitiveness, and so forth, Russian sanctions. There's a really long kind of, lots of examples of unity, but there's also examples of disunity. And so, we've got to sit there and think 27 states, you times that by 27, California to Texas to Maine here in the United States, 27 states, nation states, 750 members of the European Parliament. It's a wonder they pass legislation at all.
Well, a couple of quick points. One on the question of, I don't think it's here anymore, but on the question of democracy promotion, I'm a little skeptical because I think the EU has moved away from democracy promotion in a more active way. I think their aspiration to promote democracy have withered. It's become more defensive. I think there's internal issues around democracy around their own, member states. And yes, I mean, Kalakalas has been a very forceful defender of democracy and open government. But, keep in mind the realities of unanimous decision-making over foreign policy, the fact that there are still big dividing lines between states over priorities. I think it's going to be difficult to have significant influence on that front at the European level. On the question of, I'm not really confident about anything these days, to be very frank. But I do think, at least for the moment, yes, the AfD did really well, but there's still enough votes for others to create a workable coalition. It's still problematic from a democratic standpoint with a small d that you have 30% that feel that they're not going to be really represented by the outcome, but there's still enough of a taboo. What happens, though, if in a future election it's 40% or 45%, and not quite a majority, but really, really close to it? Then we might be in a different ballgame. But again, I think the AfD has been doing well in the eastern part of Germany now for a while. And so I don't think that's going to go anywhere. And when they're not involved in governing, it's very easy to sort of, be on the sideline and criticize. So I think that's certainly, a concern. I don't remember if there was another question I'm missing.
We have one more, and you can go back to geopolitical unity at the end.
Yes, last word, sir. Very
Okay,
quickly.
it's working. If one or both of you had to make a prediction today, do you think that Macron will end up calling a French snap election either exactly a year or very close to a year from the last one by the Constitution, or will it last longer?
That's a really hard question. Because I think that really depends on, well, first of all, it depends. I mean, if we have a constant turnover and nobody can last, then I think he's going to have to call an election. If, however, Barnier survives, there might be what you could call like a pact of non-aggression, which is essentially nobody's happy with Barnier being prime minister, but they know he's not running in 2027. He doesn't have presidential aspirations. So all of those who do are happy to let someone else be in the hot seat. So that could happen. I mean, there are cases in other countries where we've seen that happen, where they're just biding their time. So, they could be happy to let him take the really unpopular decisions and then start fighting it out for 2027. That's not a crazy scenario. They might view it in their, the left might think it's in our advantage to be on the opposition and to kind of criticize, and same for the far right. Well, yeah.
No.
Thank you so much for those of you who stayed till the bitter end. I'm sorry we can't finish on a more optimistic note. The weight of the world is not allowing us to do that. But thank you for your discussions. There's some paraphernalia such propaganda about the Transatlantic Policy Center. We welcome student engagement. Keep an eye. There's always a plethora of wonderful events. And on 2 weeks from today, on the 24th, we are welcoming a senior official from the European Parliament to talk about what next for EU foreign policy. I believe there will be free pizza at lunch. So keep an eye for that. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attention. It was a real pleasure.
We do publish student blogs on our Transatlantic Policy Center. So if you're looking to add something to your CV and resume, I don't do the editing, but choose something that's narrow. Don't try and answer somebody here. If you're going to use promotion of democracy, choose something very narrow. So don't choose European strategic autonomy. Choose something a little bit narrower, but we take a look at them. People have been using them. We're quite happy with them.
And we welcome ideas about the guests or people you want us to host. That's always fun, or ideas or regions or spotlight themes. We're always happy to hear ideas about us. Thank you.